The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
But I think the joy of salvation is like, we get pretty things. We get good sunrises. We get good sunsets. Yeah. We get really tasty food, and like the drink of the first sip of coffee in the morning. Like those are all things that I think add to that delight. So again, it's one of those things where I want to think about it and I want to remind myself of that.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Dave Connis has written young adult novels in the past, Suggested Reading and The Temptation of Adam. But his most recent books are picture books that explore the connections between human creativity and the creativity of the God in whose image we are made. The Inventions of God and Eva came out in 2021, and The Stories of God and Kiki came out earlier this year. Dave Connis, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thanks for being here.
Yes, thanks for having me. This is great. So excited
you
to
have
be here.
You have two picture books that are out. One that recently came out is The Stories of God and Kiki, and as a companion book, came out last year, The Inventions of God and Eva.
Yeah, so, actually, Kiki hasn't released yet. It's coming out July 19th. So we're still
by the time this episode releases, it will be the week of.
It will be out.
We're going to release on release week.
Look at that.
Yeah. So these are books about a theology of creativity for the juvenile set.
Yeah. That's actually a really good summary.
Well, you're welcome. Tell me about what made you even decide to write a book that involved creativity, a book for children that sort of, as I said, offers a theology of creativity.
Yeah. Well, growing up, I grew up in evangelical circles. So I went to Assemblies of God Church. And they had always talked about using your arts and using your skills for God and making art for God. But it never really went further than that. And I had wanted to write a funny Christian Jesus picture book for a while. Because I didn't read those. I have a lot of, not a lot. I have 3 kids. It oftentimes feels like 80,000, but I read a lot of picture books, and I read all sorts. So I just hadn't seen that. So I had an idea for the first picture book. Invent the stories. Gosh, I'm going to mix these titles up. The Inventions of God and Eva, and I wrote it while I was giving my kids a bath. Like I wrote it on my in a little notebook that I have, like the first draft. And it just turned into like this exploration of what does it look like to be somebody who invents, and what does that like look like when compared and contrasted to how God invented the world and invented like all of these things, dogs and sunrises and sunsets and pandas and all of this. The more I thought on that, as drafts kind of went on of the first picture book, the more it kind of unlocked into just like creativity in general. Like how does that work? Where does that come from? What does it mean that we are creative? It just kind of ballooned from there. And then when I had the chance to do the second book, as a creative writer, as a published author, I was like, well, we got to do one about stories. And that's what the Stories of God and Kiki is about. And I just think it's a really important topic, and one that I think I wanted to read about when I was, or at least hear about when I was little, just like exploring what it means to be made in the image of a creator and like the imagination, the source of imagination.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the first line, maybe it's the first line of the book, is God and Eva are a lot alike, or God and Kiki are a lot alike, which is a nice way of rephrasing we're made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And then that's sort of the thesis for the book, the thesis statement, and then you work it out, right? I mean, drawing these parallels between the fact that God makes things and that we make things, and there's a lot of interesting things going on. And by the way, the illustrations are fantastic. Tell me about that illustration.
Oh yeah, Amy is awesome. So Amy Domingo, I actually, when I had the idea, I didn't have an illustrator in mind, and I found her just scrolling through Instagram.
Really?
The way that it ended up working out, I just messaged her. I mean, I messaged her and I was like, hey, I'm working on a picture book. I can't guarantee that it's going to sell or go anywhere, but I love your stuff. We should try and do it together. And it worked out.
Yeah.
It did work out. So Amy's awesome.
Yeah. So Kiki and God and Kiki are a lot alike. God tells a story. Kiki tells a story. And well, it made me think about, I don't know if you've read Dorothy Sayers, but one of her ideas in The Mind of the Maker and other places, I think she talks about this idea that the way that the image of God is most clearly reflected in us is in the fact that we like to make stuff. And she also says that creativity, as distinct from arts, as distinct from crafts, that the act of creativity is the closest we can come to ex nihilo creation. Right? I mean, so if you carve a bowl, that's a excellent thing to do with your time, but it's not ex nihilo creation. It started out as a block of wood and then became a bowl, and that material I'm stating the obvious here, right? Whereas if you make up a story, as Sayers put it, when Shakespeare made up Hamlet, he didn't use up some raw material that he then couldn't use for Lear or whatever. And so I'm sure there's something here to say about the difference between creation and subcreation, but it may be above my pay grade. But there is something, you're tapping into something that obviously we can't do ex nihilo creation. We can create out of complete nothingness. And yet there's a creativity. We are sort of in many ways spinning things out of thin air.
Mhm.
So the floor is open.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when I look at like a blank Word doc, it feels like complete nothingness.
Yeah,
So,
right. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I totally think like when you think about the fact that you have to imagine these things, like I had to imagine Kiki into an existence, or Eva into existence, and any sort of plot you have to kind of imagine into existence, and you have to work it out, and you have to like move it around and pull things apart, but they're not coming from anywhere outside of your brain and your mind. So it's not a physical happening until you make it be physical.
Right.
So like, I think there is something about the fact that it's not like chaos and void. It's not
Right.
Although I would call my brain chaos and void, but like, it's not, what is it? Tohu wabohu. It's not that, but it is like you are coming up with things from a non-physical space. And yeah, that's like Genesis. It's like it's mirroring. It's taking part of that work that started in Genesis and continuing it and bringing in creation. Yeah.
I mean, and it is, it may not be chaos and void, but it is a movement from disorder to order, right? When you do creative work.
Yes.
And so,
at least that's the dream.
yeah, right. Yeah.
There have been many, many times in drafts where it's like, I think I just made it worse.
Sure. And if you leave it that way, then you left it worse, but you have to try, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then fix it. So you draw some parallels between the delight that we feel in our work. The children understand this idea that it's fun and delightful to make something. You draw parallels between that and how God must look at us as His creation. I mean, that there's an important theological insight, I think, to be had from our pleasure in making things. And what does that, the pleasure we feel in our creations or sub-creations, if you prefer, and to know that we are God's workmanship and that He feels the kind of pleasure that is in some ways parallel to the pleasure we feel in making. I think that's really helpful. I'm glad that's in a children's book. 2 children's books.
At least. That has. So I forget who said it. It was a musician of some sort a while back that I went to. It was a Christian musician who was talking about what he said. I write songs that I because of my career, I have to sing them over and over and over again. So I like to write songs that talk about things that I want to believe, so that if I say them over and over again, that hopefully I become closer and closer to believing them fully. And that's like a horrible paraphrase. I'm pretty sure he said it a lot better, but that has stuck with me. And I think in a lot of the times that I've had a tumultuous, there you go, relationship with writing the last, maybe 7 years, since my youngest son was born, for a lot of reasons. And I think there are a lot of times where I feel like the joy of creation has been gone. And I think because it's such a huge part of me that almost reflects on my own value. Like, I can't even create a thing. Like, I literally can't sit down and write a thing. Like, that's dumb. I'm dumb. I'm the worst. Yeah. So I think even for me drawing those parallels, I felt that with Eva, because there's a part in it where it talks about, which is, I think the part you're referring to, talks about, Eva creates a robot, Mr. Robot Tree stuff, and creates version 1, creates version 2, version 3. Sometimes she doesn't like the earlier versions, but God loves every version of us. That's one of those things. That's one of those truths that I think I want to say over and over again. And, like as a parent, you read the same books over and over again. And I was like, I just want to read, I want to read that over and over again selfishly so that I can believe it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that was an interesting moment, and something happens in both of the books where you're emphasizing how much the artist is like, or how much the child is like God, and then you have a spread or two where it's like, but here's some ways that we're not like God.
Yeah,
and as you said, that we are unhappy with our we delight in our creation, but sometimes we're unhappy with the work of our hands. Or in the case of is it Kiki who tells a story? She kind of messes up her story, like she misses an important detail. Talk to me about that. Your decision to you just did say one reason you included the spread about us not liking the work of our hands. Sometimes I'd love to hear more about that. In this book, where the thesis is we look a lot like God, then you devote some time to hear some ways.
And then I say, well, actually, and I think that for me that was important because obviously we are not God.
Yeah, right.
Like that's pretty
just
clear.
So you wouldn't have a little book of hair. My first book of heresy.
Yeah. And there are, and obviously there are ways that we are made different, and that we are not the creator, not the full creator, and that there is a level of imperfection in and maybe imperfection is a bad word, but just we're distorted, we're broken. Those are parts of our story. It's a part of the human story, and if you look at Old Testament, look like that whole arc of humanity is just all about humans suck and we are not what we need to we need a new human. It's constantly about needing a new human to fit the bill that can commune with God. And so I think it was important to me to show that difference, but not necessarily to show the difference about we suck. I think in the tradition, in the Presbyterian tradition that I've hung out in a little bit, I think that whole we suck is a really strong strong vibes. And in the evangelical side, I think that's not present enough. So there's obviously a balance of striking the fact that we were made in the image of God, therefore we have value. And that the Creator looks on us with value and love, and loves us, and loved us enough to invite us into work with Him and to bring about creation into the Eden ideal and the Eden experiment. He invited us into that to come and do it with Him. You don't just invite anybody to co-create with you. That's a huge thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to take it from that perspective of it's not just that we suck and that we're broken, but that we do have differences, and God loves us anyway. Yeah. And loves us the same, and still thinks we're pretty cool.
Yeah.
Regardless of that. What my pastor says, God doesn't just love you, He likes you.
Yeah.
And that's super accurate. Yeah.
Your Kelly Capek, professor at your alma mater, talks about.
What's up, Kelly?
He talks about the idea that he wrote a whole book about this idea of our limitations, right? That the essence of our being human is not we suck, but that we're limited. And that the whole idea of our human limitations is not, boy, you sure aren't very good at, at being, well, you sure are a sinner. I mean, yes, we are sinners. But that's not the most interesting thing about us, or the most relevant thing about us. The more relevant in terms of our relationship with God is our finitude, and we need to connect with a God who is infinite. Now, obviously, our finitude leads to sin. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to, write my first book of heresy either, right? I certainly.
Yeah. See, this is why picture books are hard, because there's all these caveats, and there's all these, like, you can introduce a concept like being made in the image of God, but like, if you don't, like, you have to be careful, because there's all these things where it's like, well, you can't take that too far, because if you take that too far, you end up like writing your own picture book heresy series. But if that's been one of the bigger struggles, is like, how do I introduce these weighty concepts and do them justice in the caveats that we know we need to make, but also make them simple enough that hopefully they come across. And you, like, because as soon as you start going into all the branches of the caveats, well, that's a conversation. That's like, you have to, like, that's a whole conversation that it just doesn't fit in. I think my books are 40 pages of maybe 10 to 15 words on each page. So it's like, that's exactly the tension. Like, you have to just like fight with it and wrestle with it and move it around and hope that, you don't like come up with your own religion while you're doing it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the truth that you touch on in both of these books, that things exist because of God's delight. Things exist because God wants them to exist. At one point you say God invented Eva because he wanted to share the things that make him happy: inventing, fixing, jumping in puddles, loving others. Delight as a creative force. It's a really helpful reminder to know that's where this world came from, is God's delight, and why it still spins because of God's delight.
Yep. Yeah, I can't remember what verse it is. It's close to the beginning where it's talking about God made trees, talking about the trees God made, and they're both, I think it's both good to look at and good to eat.
Yeah.
And both of those things. Yeah, it's very cool. Both of those things, especially the good to look at, like, that doesn't even have function, right? Like, at least
that
with
comes
eating,
first, I think, in that passage.
Yeah, I think it does. Like, at least with eating, it's like you have something that you get out of it. You get calories, you get energy, you can, make your body go by eating. But with good to look at, it's pretty. It's nice. It's nice to have around. It's like all the plants we have on our fireplace mantle.
Yeah.
And I think, like, that's in the beginning. Like, we start there.
Yeah.
And I think we, you go through, and there's just all of this undercurrent of enough, and making things because they are good in their own right, and enjoying those things. Like Ecclesiastes talks about the gift of God, and joy being able to enjoy those gifts, and be preoccupied by joy. And those are all things that are really easy to forget about.
Yeah.
In light of, just like the life, just, the fact that I'm sitting in a room filled with like dangerous Legos all over the floor, and that somebody's probably going to have to clean that up, and I'm going to have to fight with my 6-year-old to do it. And that like, I've got to finish up a project before, Tuesday, like you just forget about the delight of things. And I've been really, and I think that is dramatically tied to joy as well as like the joy of salvation. And the joy of salvation isn't just like, oh, cool, I'm like good to go. I'm saved. And I've always struggled with that because I think I've always made it be that. But I think the joy of salvation is like, we get pretty things. We get good sunrises. We get good sunsets. We get really tasty food, and like the drink of the first sip of coffee in the morning. Like those are all things that I think add to that delight. So again, it's one of those things where I want to think about it and I want to remind myself of that. And
you said you've struggled the last 7 years with writing. Has some of that been a failure of delight?
Oh, the sigh is because that's a big question. I think in some ways, yes. And then I think in some ways it's been some rough years in there. And delight was it wasn't necessarily writing's fault. I just don't think delight was anywhere to be found. And, in the middle of, and in some of that too, it's just like my own process, like wrestling with my own process. There's some stuff there. My dad died unexpectedly in 2017. There's some stuff there. We had a miscarriage in between all there. We've got 3 young kids now that are not sleeping in the night. So I think it's just all of those.
Hard to maintain delight in those circumstances.
Yes. Because you're just surviving. Yeah. And I think we're coming out of that. I
hope so.
In some ways, I mean, I'm sure there's always seasons. I'm sure there's going to be something new, but I think even in the last few months, I would say that delight is returning for the first time since in ways that I'm finally reconnecting to writing. It's been really nice. I thought I was just broken and that I was just done. It was terrifying. It was really scary.
Well, I've been there. I know what that's like. So I'm glad to hear that you reach a point in your adulthood, I think, where you realize that that not performing is not the same thing as being broken. and that just because things are not going well today and weren't going yesterday or even this time last year, that doesn't mean things are never going to work out again. So, sounds like you are.
I look forward to that day. Well, yeah, because there. The process stuff. I mean, I created when I first started writing, my initial process was, I had the ability to write basically all day because I didn't have kids and I was working a job that required me to be on site and be around and answer questions. But like, for the most part, it was fairly isolated. So I just spent all of the in-between time just writing. Yeah. And that's how I created my first kind of like rituals and creative processes. Well, as you know, that is not normal. And, we had our first kid and we moved out of that. And then I got different jobs and everything. And I just never got equilibrium. And it took me until literally this year to realize, the process that I created way back when I was like basically a barely married, no kid, young whippersnapper who didn't have any responsibilities doesn't work for a full-time dad of 3 children. Surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you figure out what works, but that doesn't mean it's going to work forever.
Right. Yeah. And of course it changes. So it's been I've said many times, I've been rediscovering myself for the last 7 years, and it's been a lot of work.
Well, that was nice that 7 years ago, or how many years ago, you had the opportunity to sort of have that process. But the truth is, the things that you have, the ways that you have grown and grown into yourself since then, in those times where you maybe couldn't put as many hours into writing, that's not wasted either, Yeah. I would, frankly, I would rather read something from somebody in their, deep 30s and 40s who doesn't have as much time as somebody in their 20s who does have plenty of time.
The
right?
20s who just kind of hanging out and drinking LaCroix and tossing back some popcorn at their kitchen table. Yeah. That's a good point. It's not wasted. It's not wasted time.
Yeah,
I need to remember that.
You say one little spread I like, or a page I like, is in the Kiki book, and there's a very similar page in the Eva book. God thinks Kiki is awesome when Kiki does Kiki things, or when Eva does Eva things. Has that truth, when Dave does Dave, God thinks Dave is awesome when Dave does Dave things, is that sunk in for you, and does it have any effect on your creative work when it does or when it doesn't?
I think it might just depend on the day.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would say in some ways, yes, more than others. Like I've always known that my imagination and my creativity come from God.
Yeah.
Like I think that's been fairly clear in my head. I think it's a lot more of a jump for me to connect my imagination and creativity in his delight in me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because that first thing, I've got these gifts, that's something that you can feel, responsible. Like, that's something for me to steward. That's something for me to be responsible for. And, and you get to, in some way, be in control of that.
Yeah. It's very kinetic. Like I write, I know that when I do this, it is what I was made to be. It is what I like. It's part of me, and it's how I work, and it's part of my personality. And the idea of that specific thing being a source of delight for God, conceptually it makes sense. When it comes to feeling that is a lot harder for me. And I have a lot more work to do to, I think, maybe get to a point where I truly feel the delight of God. What is that? Oh, what is the movie where it's about the runner?
Chariots of Fire.
And he talks about, I feel God's presence.
Maybe fast.
Running. Or something like that.
Yeah. I feel his pleasure.
I want that. I want to get there. And I believe and I hope that I can.
Do you find it easier to imagine that God's annoyed whenever you're not using your gifts properly?
Yes, I do. And that's the question is that my annoyance in myself as well, like projected on God and how he feels about me? Because I do that a lot too. It's a lot easier for me to be cynical than it is to think that somebody is happy with me. Yeah,
sure.
It's just, and some of that is I'm just a recovering cynic. Like I'm constantly eternally wrestling with that part of myself. So I think by default, that's just where I go. So it's a rewiring, the tuning your heart, right? Like, that's good. Come thou fount, tune my heart to sing that phrase. And And I think you have to tune your heart to do a lot more than just sing praise. Like, I think like this is one of those things where it's just like, you got to tune my heart to not be a cynical jerk all the time.
Yeah.
Even to myself.
Good. All right, Dave, I always end these conversations with not always. I usually end with this question. Who are the writers that make you want to write? Which writers make you want to go try it?
Yeah. So I did actually think about this because I always struggle with this question. So I was like, I'm going to have an answer this time. And it depends on, I like reading across the board. So there are people in each genre that I've really enjoyed that make me want to write in that genre, but also just across genres. So for graphic novels, Tim Probert, he's so imaginative, so funny, so accessible, and just like nostalgic somehow. So Tim Probert, Ben Hackey, middle grade, all the names are leaving me now. Middle grade, I would say Kate DiCamillo.
Oh yeah.
Just like quality classics. She's so good.
Yeah.
Daniel Nayeri, who wrote Everything Sad is Untrue. After I read that book, I just wanted to write.
I've not read it yet.
Oh, it's so good. It's just so good. And then for picture books, Beatrice Blue. She's very folklory and very just like kind of mythical, and it feels awesome. I love that. John Klassen, who's just is the master of simplicity. Just like the hat series. I want my hat. This isn't my hat. It's classic. It's just so good. And then for young adult, Naomi Novik and Jordan Ifueko. I think I'm saying that right. They're just solid. It's just like good writing, really imaginative. And then in general, I guess adult like side, Frederick Bachman, N.K. Jessamine, and this might be a cop-out answer, but the biblical authors. Because the Bible is just a incredible piece of literature. With the amount of cross references and the intentional structures and just the way across time, like I've done the thought experiment. If I were to try and get writers to commit to not writing the Bible, but just like an experiment of a piece of literature written across thousands of years that self-references everything, each book, that would be impossible to do. And just thinking about that sort of intentionality makes me want to write better as well. So that's my answers.
All right. Well, Dave Connis, thanks so much for being here. This has been fun to talk.
Yes, Jonathan Rogers, thanks for inviting me. This is great.
I hope lots of small people read about Eva and Kiki.
I do too. Small people, big humans, tiny humans, mid-sized humans. All right. Thank you.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.